In December 1963, a thin veil of early winter cold descended over the coastal town of Millbridge, carrying with it a heavy, nameless dread. Millbridge had always been peaceful, a place where life moved slowly and quietly, where the sound of church bells and footsteps on cobblestone streets rang clear every morning. Yet that peace was torn apart one weekend evening when young schoolteacher Elara Davies suddenly vanished. The story of her disappearance gradually became a dark cloud hanging over the entire small community, stirring uneasy premonitions and whispers that spread swiftly from house to house. And in that silence, strange pieces began to emerge, leading the way to a mystery that would haunt the town for years to come. Elara Davies was a 25-year-old woman beloved by the town for her kindness and dedication to her students. She lived in a small wooden house on the edge of a pine forest, where the sea wind blew through her windows every night. Her life was quiet, but filled with the light of a young person preparing to step into the future she had always dreamed of, especially with her wedding to her fiancé, Victor Sterling, planned for the following spring. People often saw her walking slowly along the path into town on weekend market days, carrying her familiar canvas bag, always wearing a gentle smile and greeting everyone she knew. That was why, when Elara did not return after going to the market on Saturday evening, worrying spread quickly, like a spark fanned by strong wind. Sheriff David Harris was the first to receive the report, and he sprang into action with a deep sense of unease. David was a middle-aged man who had served in the military, carrying with him the discipline and unwavering loyalty to his duty. He knew Millbridge better than anyone, the streets, the alleys, and the character of every resident. So, when he heard that a woman like Elara had disappeared without a trace, he knew this was no simple matter. When he arrived at Elara's house, David clung to a faint hope that she had simply gone somewhere and forgotten to tell anyone. But that hope vanished the moment he stood before the tightly closed wooden door and noticed the first strange detail. The door was locked from the inside. The fact that the door was locked from the inside immediately set David's mind racing through countless possibilities. A person who disappears while their house is locked from within either means she was still inside, or she had left through some other means without leaving a trace, an idea that seemed absurd. Since the small house had only one entrance and two windows, both sealed shut, David had no choice but to break the lock. When he stepped inside, he found no signs of disturbance. Everything was tidy, from the books on the shelf to the winter coat she always wore. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing broken, no indication anyone had broken in, and that made the silence inside the house even more terrifying. Moving deeper into the kitchen, David noticed Elara's familiar canvas bag placed neatly on a chair, still containing the items she had bought at the market that evening. It was strange that someone about to prepare dinner would vanish mid-task without taking her things. The mystery deepened when he found her heavy winter coat hanging on the rack by the door. Winter nights in Millbridge were so cold that no one could survive outside without a coat. This made David certain that Elara had never left the house in the usual way. The only question remaining was, if she hadn't left through the front door, what had happened to her? Searching the house yielded no clear answers, but when he spoke to people who had seen Elara at the market that evening, David learned that she had left around dusk, carrying her bag and looking slightly anxious. Some said she seemed preoccupied, but since Elara was naturally thoughtful, no one paid much attention. All witnesses confirmed she had walked home along the main road as usual. No one saw her after that. This made the moment of her disappearance mysterious, an unexplainable void. During the investigation, Sheriff David quickly went to speak with Victor Sterling, Elara's fiancé. Victor was a young man who worked in construction, generally regarded as quiet but serious. He was the one who had contacted the police just a few hours after failing to reach Elara. However, as David clarified his statement, several inconsistencies emerged. Victor claimed he had called Elara that evening before she went to the market, but the timing of the call and some details of their conversation did not match when others had seen her at the market. These discrepancies made Victor the first person to fall under suspicion. Still, David remained cautious. He knew inconsistencies could stem from panic, but when he checked the phone records, he discovered Victor had called Elara later. Then he claimed that she had already left the market and was likely very close to home. This strengthened the theory that Victor knew more than he was letting on. Victor also grew visibly uncomfortable when David pressed him about his relationship with Elara in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Stories began to surface from people close to the couple about minor arguments, about Elara feeling uneasy as the wedding approached. While suspicion increasingly focused on Victor, David continued searching Elara's house for clues. He found a small journal hidden under her pillow, in which she wrote her private thoughts. The pages revealed she had been under significant pressure from many directions, especially regarding the wedding preparations. She described feeling watched when walking through the pine forest near her house in the afternoons. She wrote about hearing footsteps behind her, only to turn and see no one. She even mentioned feeling stared at through her windows at night. These details forced David to consider the possibility that someone other than Victor might be involved. While examining the area around the house, David noticed faint marks on the soft soil near the back window, footprints that appeared to have been blurred by the wind. This made him wonder whether someone had approached the house around the time Elara returned. If someone had been waiting, it could explain the door being locked from the inside. Perhaps Elara had entered the house unaware of the intruder, and something happened before she could leave again. But that theory still left many gaps. In the days that followed, David focused on analyzing every detail. Milbridge's narrow roads and sparse population made it hard to believe someone could come and go at night undetected. Yet the harsh winter winds and thick fog could conceal anything. People rarely went out after dark. Everything combined to create a perfect environment for a secret act to take place. David did not rule out the possibility that Elara's disappearance might be connected to some secret she had stumbled upon. The journal entries revealed her anxiety stemmed not only from the upcoming marriage, but from something deeper she hadn't dared speak about. Scattered phrases hinted that she was holding onto a truth she wasn't sure she should share. This made David even more convinced that the case was not merely personal. In the following days, the investigation became the talk of the town, from the coffee shop to the general store. Everyone had a theory. Some believed Elara had run away due to wedding pressure. Others thought Victor was involved. A few suspected something strange in the forest near her house, but all were just guesses. No one had evidence. Sheriff David continued gathering information, following even the smallest leads. Yet the deeper he dug, the more he felt the truth about the night Elara vanished lay in a darkness far greater than he had imagined. The locked door, the timing of Victor's call, the marks beneath the window, the unease in her journal, all were pieces of a puzzle missing its center. Some crucial part remained unfound, and that missing piece might explain everything. At that time, the disappearance of schoolteacher Elara Davies remained an unsolved mystery. It launched a long investigation, a shadow that fell over the small town during that cold winter of 1963. The events that followed would ensure the people of Milbridge never forgot her name, and that Sheriff David Harris would carry the case like an unresolved silence throughout his career. In the weeks following the start of the investigation, Elara Davies' disappearance entered a bleak phase unlike anything the town of Milbridge had ever experienced. From late December 1963 into the early months of 1964, The initial urgency of the search faded, giving way to heaviness and disappointment. Forensic technology of that era, especially in a small town like Millbridge, offered no access to modern methods of detecting evidence. Every clue gathered felt like a piece of rotten wood crumbling the moment it was grasped. Still, Sheriff David Harris never wavered. He knew that no matter how thick the veil of truth, it would always have tiny cracks, and it was through those cracks that the next clue emerged, one both clear and haunting. As winter piled on thicker layers of snow, a group of town volunteers helped police expand the search around Elara's house. On a dreary morning, with weak sunlight piercing the frost, they discovered an object lying oddly on the frozen ground not far from the tree line. It was a deep red scarf, the kind everyone in town knew belonged to Elara because she wore it whenever she went out in the cold. The bright red stood out against the gray, icy ground like a streak of frozen blood, making the morning air feel heavier. Sheriff David immediately recognized the gravity of the find. The scarf lay only a short distance from the house, but what struck him more was that it was lightly dusted with frost, meaning it had been there for days. This created a strange contradiction. The area had been thoroughly searched in the early days, yet no one had found it. Had someone placed the scarf there later to mislead them? Or had the search team missed it because of the heavy snow? Not far from the scarf, another discovery abruptly shifted the investigation. On the hardened ground was a deep tire track, large and distinct from the usual marks left by townspeople's vehicles. The track belonged to a dual-wheeled truck, a type rare in the area since few in Millbridge owned one. The depth of the imprint showed the truck had stopped long enough for its weight to press deeply into the frozen earth. This suggested the vehicle might be directly connected to Elara's disappearance. Sheriff David carefully photographed and sketched every groove of the track, knowing that with the town's limited resources, identifying the tire would be difficult, but he was meticulous, aware that sometimes the smallest signs open the door to truth. When the new clues were brought back to the station, a mix of excitement and anxiety filled the air. Word spread through Millbridge that the mysterious truck might have carried an abductor or even a killer. Some said the scarf had been dropped as a marker or to cover the stranger's tracks. Rumors grew, fueling tension around the case. Sheriff David, not wanting the only hope to turn into panic, kept the information quiet and continued investigating in silence. Yet just days later, the case took another unexpected turn. A letter arrived at Elara's mother's house in Rockland. She received it on a chilly afternoon in early 1964 and immediately sensed something off about the type lettering on the envelope. There was no return address. Inside, a short typed message claimed Elara was alive and trying to contact her family. It said she had needed to leave Millbridge for personal reasons and asked everyone to stop looking for her. Though the content seemed meant to reassure, Elara's mother knew the voice was not her daughter's. The wording was strange and stiff, devoid of warmth or any trace of the girl she had raised. She contacted the police at once, and the letter became a critical piece of evidence. Sheriff David felt a chill down his spine as he read it. Every word seemed crafted not to comfort, but to mislead. It complicated the case. If the letter was genuine, Elara might have left willingly. If forged, the perpetrator was deliberately painting a false picture to slow the investigation. What troubled David most was not the content, but how it was produced. He immediately noticed the typeface, the ink, and the depth of the impressions. From years of living in the area, he recognized it could have come from a very common typewriter of the time as Smith Corona, and by an eerie coincidence, Victor Sterling, Elara's fiancé, owned a Smith Corona typewriter in his home office. Though this was only a hunch, it significantly heightened suspicion toward Victor. Many described the couple's relationship in the final months as strained. Victor had been overheard arguing lightly with Elara near the market, and some said the young teacher seemed anxious about the upcoming wedding. But all of it remained hearsay without proof. Accusing someone based on rumors was unacceptable to David, yet he could not deny the pieces were forming a disturbing picture. David compared the letter to other typed documents Victor had submitted for work in town. However, with the crude forensic technology of the time, proving two documents came from the same typewriter was nearly impossible. The Smith Corona model Victor owned was mass-produced, with nearly identical typefaces nationwide. Each machine might leave unique marks, but verifying them by eye was almost impossible. David had to file the letter as a notable clue but not solid evidence. Meanwhile, the dual-wheel truck tire track remained unsolved. David sent descriptions to neighboring towns to see if anyone owned such a vehicle, but responses were scarce. That type of truck was typically used for heavy hauling, while most people around Millbridge were fishermen or craftsmen. Even weeks later, no one reported seeing such a truck in town around the time Elara vanished. This made the track both vital and deeply mysterious, a trace of someone who had come and gone in the night. As the indirect evidence, the red scarf, the tire track, the letter began forming a sequence of events. David knew he was on the right path, but still missing the central piece. Each clue was like a path into dense woods, only to end in darkness. Yet he persisted, re-examining every detail. Elara disappeared on her way home. The tire track appeared near her house. The scarf was found nearby, and the letter was mailed from Rockland, not far from Millbridge, but far enough for a culprit to believe their trail was covered. And all of it happened between late 1963 and early 1964, when blizzards, hail, and the brutal Maine winter could erase the most crucial traces. The early months of 1964 passed in stalemate. No body, no witnesses, no direct evidence. No one in town wanted to believe a young woman could vanish so coldly. People in Millbridge began fearing a stranger was lurking among them, or that the secret lay buried deeper within their own community. The long winter nights made the fear more acute. Whenever the wind howled through the trees, people thought of Elara and wondered where she was, whether she was still alive or had met something far worse. Sheriff David was not immune to the obsession. Every night he sat in his office, poring over files, studying crime scene photos, and asking himself what he was missing. He often recalled Elara's eyes in photographs taken before she disappeared, kind eyes with a faint shadow of unease now shrouded in countless unanswered questions. He remembered her mother's stunned face when she received the letter, the deep red scarf, the tire track pressed into the frozen ground. They all flickered through his mind like recurring images, reminding him the case was still there, waiting to be unlocked. But then, the harsh reality of the era forced the investigation into a dead end. There was no fiber analysis technology, no modern fingerprint testing, no way to accurately identify tire patterns or match typewriters. No matter how hard he tried, the limitations of the 1960s remained an impenetrable wall that David could not breach. After many lengthy meetings, the police department was forced to make the painful decision, due to lack of conclusive evidence and no body ever being found. The disappearance of Elara Davies was officially classified as a cold case. That decision cut through the town of Millbridge's fragile hope like a knife. Even though the file was closed, for Sheriff David Harris, the case was never over. He kept every scrap of paper, every report, every photograph from the scene in a separate drawer, a constant reminder of what remained unresolved. He knew time could erase everything, from tire tracks in the soil to witnesses' memories, but some mysteries refuse to rest until they are brought to light. Elara Davies, with her wordless vanishing, had become an inseparable part of Millbridge's history. From late 1963 into 1964, no one in town thought Elara's case would simply fade into silence. Yet the years that followed would show that silence was only the surface. Beneath it ran undercurrents, waiting for the right moment to rise and bring the story back into the light once more. Much of what happened later stemmed from clues that seemed meaningless, that winter especially, the deep red scarf, the mysterious dual wheel tire track, and the typed letter sent from Rockland. Those three pieces laid the foundation for a mystery far greater than anyone in Millbridge had ever imagined. From the early days of 1964, when Elara Davies' case was shelved as cold, time began to flow like a river frozen under thick ice. What once shook the entire town gradually sank into silence. Yet that silence did not erase the haunting memory of the young teacher's disappearance. It only pushed the obsession deeper, like a persistent undertow that never truly vanished. In the years that followed, the people of Millbridge still spoke Elara's name with regret and even fear. But life went on. Children grew up. Stores changed hands. Roads were repaired, and amid all those changes, only the Elara Davies case remained frozen in a patch of darkness that refused to move. Victor Sterling left Maine just a few months after the case was closed. He told a few acquaintances he wanted to start a new life somewhere without the weight of the past pressing down on him. No one knew where he went, and no one wanted to ask too deeply. Suspicious eyes followed him until he disappeared from town, as if the whole community breathed a quiet sigh of relief at being rid of a dark spot that had made them uneasy. But for Sheriff David Harris, that departure was anything but simple. It felt like the last thread in a maze had been cut, leaving every effort to solve the case hanging in emptiness. Still, David never shook the feeling that Victor had taken the secret of Elara's disappearance with him when he left Millbridge. In the years that followed, David continued quietly but relentlessly reviewing the clues. Every winter, when snow blanketed the rooftops, he would open the old drawer where he kept his notes and reread every page of the file to remind himself the case must never be forgotten. He knew the technology of his time could not provide clear evidence like fingerprints, fiber analysis, or precise mechanical comparisons, but he believed that one day the future would bring opportunities the present could not. That belief led him to do something none of his colleagues at the Millbridge Police Department ever knew about. Before retiring, David spent nearly a year painstakingly copying by hand and typewriter the most important documents related to the case. He carefully selected every detail, every note he believed might matter someday. Among them were his analyses of the typeface from Victor Sterling's Smith Corona typewriter, the subtle marks on the impressions only a meticulous observer would notice. He preserved sketches of the dual-wheel truck tire track, crime scene descriptions, and even his own private theories never entered into the official file. He understood that once retired, he would lose access to investigative records, and those notes might be buried forever in police archives. David refused to let that happen. He carried the sense that Elara's case still held hidden corners, and if they were not preserved, fragile clues would be swallowed by time. So he created an entirely separate dossier kept in an old wooden box tucked into the deepest drawer of the cabinet in his home office. The box was secured with a military-grade lock, and he hid the key in a place only he knew. It was not an act of defiance against regulations, but a way to protect the truth from the erosion of time and the forgetfulness that often follows cases no longer spoken of. From the mid-1960s through the 1970s, Millbridge changed considerably. New residents arrived, others left, but Elara's story was still told on winter evenings around fireplaces. Children who grew up hearing it treated it like a chilling local legend. For David, though, it was no legend, it was an unresolved truth. That truth lived in the pages he kept hidden, waiting for a chance to be revived. Every passing year reminded him that Elara's disappearance could not possibly have been a mere accident or a voluntary departure. He always believed Victor Sterling was directly involved, even if he could not prove it at the time. By the 1980s, David was aging, his hair turning silver, his health declining. Yet the memories of the case never faded. He often recalled the image of the frost-covered red scarf, the deep dual wheel track pressed into frozen ground, the typed letter he was certain did not carry Elara's voice, and he remembered clearly the inconsistencies in Victor's statement about that final phone call, the delay in timing, the contradictions in description, all forming an incomplete picture. He could not stop pondering. Those memories played in his mind like repeating film reels, compelling him to keep preserving his personal file. By the 1990s, forensic technology in America was advancing rapidly. Fingerprints could be analyzed more accurately, fibers compared, typewriters examined with new methods. But David had long since retired. He lived a quiet life by the Maine coast, stepping outside each day for a breath of air before returning home to a hot cup of tea. In his small house, the wooden box remained in its place, an inseparable part of his life. Though his health weakened, he still made a habit of opening it several times a year to review his notes. It was his way of reminding himself that he still owed a promise to Elara Davies and to his own conscience. Time marched on into the 21st century. Outside, the world changed rapidly, but the documents David preserved lay untouched, carefully protected from the dust of years. In the first decade of the new century, his health declined noticeably, and he began to worry that one day the wooden box would be forgotten. If that happened, every vital record he had spent a lifetime safeguarding would vanish, and Elara Davies's case would be buried forever. That fear led him to draft a secret will, designating a distant nephew the only person he told about the box's existence, in the hope that someday a new generation would have both the technology and the persistence to reopen the file. By 2012, nearly half a century had passed since Elara Davies disappeared. 49 years of silence had encased the case like thick ice. Yet that silence was not oblivion. Beneath it lay the secret files David had guarded all his life, notes he believed could one day open the door to truth. He always thought the scattered pieces would eventually find their place, and a future generation could finish what he could not. For him, preserving those documents was not just a sheriff's duty, it was a personal promise to a young woman who vanished in the winter of 1963. When David died at the end of that year, the wooden box in his study became his most important legacy. Inside were detailed notes on typewriter analysis, descriptions of the tire track, crime scene sketches, and personal deductions he had kept to himself. Together they formed a shadow case file existing outside the official system, a file that carried the soul of an investigation spanning nearly half a century. Thanks to his preservation, crucial clues never disappeared and were kept intact for a future he always believed would come. And it was the existence of those documents that paved the way for the later reinvestigation, laying the groundwork for a new chapter one Milbridge had waited 49 long years to see. Those notes were not only proof of David Harris's perseverance, but also testimony to the belief that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to resurface. The year 2012 marked the moment when groundbreaking advances in forensic science finally offered the last chance for a case long thought lost to oblivion. In the quiet office of the Maine Cold Case Unit, Lieutenant Alex Holt reviewed dusty boxes of files that generations of previous investigators had been forced to shelve. Inside those aging folders were dozens of pieces of evidence dismissed in the 1960s, when the world could not yet imagine DNA technology would completely transform the search for truth. Yellowed papers, evidence bags nearly rotted away, and faded handwritten notes became the only remaining sources of information about schoolteacher Elara Davies' disappearance. With patience and precision, Alex Holt began sorting every detail, bringing them all back into the light for examination with modern technology. One of the most critical pieces of evidence among those files was the forged letter sent to Elara's mother in late 1963, typed on a typewriter and bearing a clumsy fake signature. It was meant to suggest Elara was alive somewhere far away. For decades, it had been regarded merely as a perpetrator's attempt to mislead, with no legal value due to the lack of biological trace analysis. But when the old envelope was submitted to Maine's modern DNA lab, it became the turning point that changed everything. Faint smudges on the envelope flap, once dismissed as meaningless stains, were identified as residual biological traces from saliva and skin cells. Though decades had degraded most of the genetic material, advanced DNA extraction techniques were still able to recover a complete genetic profile. When the results came back, the lab immediately sent an urgent alert to Alex Holt. The DNA extracted from the envelope matched perfectly with a profile in Maine's database belonging to Victor Sterling, Elara's former fiancé. The match was not random similarity, but absolute identity, proving that Victor Sterling himself had licked the envelope flap before mailing it in 1963. This shattered decades of his claims of innocence. As Victor had always insisted, he knew nothing about the letter and had no part in sending it. A seemingly tiny piece of evidence had now established a direct link between him and the act of concealment. Yet one DNA result from the envelope alone was not enough to close the case. The justice system requires tight connections between multiple forms of evidence. Lieutenant Alex Holt continued, examining the evidence inventory, and came across a long-overlooked item, documentation of a truck floor mat seized from Victor Sterling's old dual-wheel truck in the early 1960s. The -1 had been taken after Victor left Millbridge, but due to technological limitations at the time, police could only note some dark stains without determining whether they were blood or ordinary dirt. Drawing on his experience and knowledge of modern trace DNA testing, Alex Holt immediately requested the mat recovery and sent it for analysis. Though the mat had aged nearly 50 years, it still retained a small amount of organic material absorbed deep between the fibers. Modern chemical testing confirmed the stains were human blood, and soon afterward full DNA profiling returned a result. The genetic sequence matched 100% with Elara Davies' profile, cross-referenced against samples from her direct relatives. This absolute match eliminated any possibility of error and proved beyond doubt that Elara's body had at some point been in contact with the mat inside Victor Sterling's truck. It was the most direct evidence in the entire case, a link the 1960s investigators could not decode, now serving as irrefutable confirmation of Victor's involvement. Each new discovery added pressure to the layers of dust covering the case. Records of Victor Sterling's actions at the time of Elara's disappearance were re-examined by Alex Holt. Victor's claims of not driving his truck on the day she vanished were completely refuted by the DNA on the mat. The contradictions between his statements and the scientific evidence rendered every defense he had used for decades meaningless. No detail remained strong enough to shield or obscure the truth etched into the physical evidence. Beyond the two key items, Alex Holt also re-evaluated indirect evidence once deemed inconclusive. Earlier analyses of Victor's Smith Corona typewriter had noted similarities between the forged letter's impressions and his machine, but technical limitations prevented absolute certainty. In the modern era, using algorithms that measure impression depth and keystrike friction characteristics, experts built detailed comparison models between the old letter and samples taken from the still preserved were patterns on Victor's typewriter keys. The results showed near-perfect congruence, further solidifying the direct connection between Victor and the creation of the misleading letter. Alex Holt compiled all the data into a comprehensive report presented to the main investigative board. The report not only listed every piece of evidence, but reconstructed the entire sequence of events through the lens of modern forensic science. The most critical section was the complete linkage between Victor Sterling's DNA on the envelope and Elara Davies' DNA on the truck mat. Together, these two pieces formed an unbreakable chain of reasoning, proving not only Victor's involvement in covering up evidence, but his direct role in Elara's death. DNA technology did more than decode traces. It gave voice to a victim silenced for nearly half a century. The microscopic cells on the envelope, the drops of blood soaked into dark fibers, and the seemingly scattered details in old files all combined to form a coherent story of the truth. The silence of physical evidence became the loudest testimony, overpowering every denial and every attempt at concealment that had been erected since 1963. When Alex Holt's final report was completed and forwarded to prosecutors, the case no longer lingered in the gray area of suspicion. It became a file with clear grounds for charges. From grains of dust and faint traces once thought meaningless, DNA technology delivered absolute certainty, bringing Victor Sterling's name back under the light of justice. Everything he had tried to hide with the forged letter and his flight from Millbridge was peeled away layer by layer, exposing a truth no longer deniable. The Elara Davies case thereby entered its final phase, where justice began to find its way after nearly 50 years blocked by the limitations of a bygone era. In 2012 and 2013, when forensic science had advanced enough to pierce veils of secrecy once thought impenetrable, law enforcement in Maine finally achieved a decisive breakthrough in a case believed forgotten for nearly half a century. Victor Sterling, at 74 years old, faced the darkest chapter of his life as scientific evidence closed in, with no room left to escape. Everything uncovered pointed to one irreversible truth. He was the person who had taken Elara Davies' life nearly 50 years earlier and had managed to conceal his crime through clumsy but long-effective methods, kept alive only by the scientific limitations of the time that had forced the case into cold case status for decades. Throughout the long years following the mysterious disappearance of Elara Davies, the small Maine town community remained haunted by the story of the young woman who vanished without a trace. Though numerous theories were put forward, none rested on evidence strong enough for authorities to take another step. In those years, Victor Sterling's shadow lingered among the people like someone carrying an enormous secret that no one could prove he was part of. Victor himself lived what seemed a peaceful life in a distant state, convinced the truth had been buried with time. Yet everything changed after the Maine Cold Case Unit was established and began reviewing unresolved cases with unusual signs, and the Elara Davies case was one of them. When the new investigative team systematically reorganized the entire old file and applied modern analytical methods, they uncovered many important points that had been overlooked due to the limitations of old technology. Though the initial clues were quite scattered, when pieced together they painted a suspicious picture centered on Victor Sterling, especially his connection to the forged letter sent in 1963, in which the writer, pretending to be Elara, claimed she had decided to leave and start a new life elsewhere. That very letter had led her family and the police at the time to believe her disappearance was voluntary, derailing the investigation for many years. Around 2012, when the DNA sample obtained from the back flap of the forged envelope was analyzed using modern technology, the team received undeniable results. The biological trace on the adhesive matched Victor Sterling's DNA exactly. This discovery instantly erased all past ambiguity and placed Victor at the center of suspicion with powerfully conclusive evidence. It was also the critical turning point that prompted police to dig up many old pieces of evidence that had been in storage for decades, among them an old truck bed mat that had belonged to Victor Sterling at the time of Elara Davies' disappearance. When blood samples recovered from that mat were reanalyzed using modern DNA systems, the results shocked the entire team. They matched perfectly with Elara Davies' stored DNA profile taken from her personal belongings. This meant that not only was Victor linked to the forged letter, but he had also had direct contact with the victim's blood. Thus, the chain of evidence became airtight and unbreakable, sufficient to obtain an arrest warrant for Victor Sterling from the court. Without any legal obstacles, Victor Sterling was subsequently arrested in the state where he was living and extradited to Maine for investigation. Though he initially remained silent and tried to dodge every question, the pressure from the DNA evidence was too overwhelming for him to keep making excuses or circling around the truth. Matters grew even worse when witness Clara came forward and testified that Victor had once asked her to help burn some items he said he no longer wanted to keep. Right after Elara Davies disappeared, Clara Lee's statement became a crucial piece that confirmed Victor had attempted to destroy evidence of his crime many years earlier. When all the evidence was laid out on the interrogation table, Victor finally had no way to deny it any longer. He was forced to confess to investigators what had really happened on that fateful night. His confession revealed a heartbreaking truth. Everything began with a heated argument between him and Elara Davies. According to Victor, the fight spiraled out of control, causing Elara to fall and hit her head, resulting in her death. In that moment, instead of calling for help or owning up to his mistake, he chose the worst possible path, disposing of her body to cover up his actions, then burying her remains near the remote Naragwagas River area where few people ever went. After Victor Sterling confessed, the investigative team immediately launched a search based on his directions. When they reached the area along the Naragwagas River, they located Elara Davies' skeletal remains buried beneath decades of soil and decayed leaves. Recovering the victim's body served as the final piece of evidence that closed the entire case and returned the truth her family had longed for over nearly half a century. In 2013, after a lengthy trial, Victor Sterling was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. This sentence was regarded as the justice system's definitive affirmation against an act of taking a life and concealing the crime for 49 years. For the Maine community, it was not only a victory for justice, but also proof of the power of modern science in answering a question left unresolved for far too long and finally bringing peace to Elara Davies' soul. The case was closed, yet its echoes lingered as a reminder of the power of time and technological progress, that no matter how hard a perpetrator tries to hide the truth, it always finds a way back into the light. The case also became a prime example of the Maine Cold Case Unit's relentless efforts to seek justice for those whose voices had been taken away, showing that justice, even when delayed, is still justice and still carries the power to restore a community's faith in truth and righteousness. The story of Elara Davies' case and the nearly half-century-long journey to uncover the truth carries many profound lessons about justice, responsibility, ethics, and the power of science in modern society. Looking back at the entire journey, we realize that although time is long, it is never enough to completely erase the traces of truth, for whatever belongs to essence will always find its way back to the light. Victor Sterling's confession in the final years of his life is proof of that. Crime may be slow to be discovered, but it never truly disappears. and no perpetrator ever fully escapes the consequences as long as justice is nurtured by the perseverance of people who never give up. The first lesson lies in the perseverance of law enforcement officers, especially the main cold case unit people who spent years reviewing files that seemed forever forgotten. Their work stemmed not only from professional duty, but from the belief that every lost life deserves to have its voice restored. This case shows that perseverance is sometimes the very key that opens the door to truth when all hope appears lost. And thanks to that perseverance, evidence once thought useless an old envelope, a truck mat finally found its voice in an era when science was strong enough to understand what people of the past could not. The second lesson comes from the power of science and technology. Without the dramatic development of DNA analysis technology, this case would likely have remained forever in darkness, and the truth would have been buried along with the victim's family and community's pain. Through this we see that science does not merely bring progress to daily life. It also plays a vital role in upholding justice, resolving past mistakes, and creating opportunities to heal wounds left by time. This reminds us that investing in science, especially forensic science, is of utmost importance, for it is a powerful tool that brings society closer to truth and justice. The third lesson is a warning about the consequences of wrong choices made in moments of anger. Victor Sterling's act of killing did not stem from premeditation, but from an argument that spiraled out of control. This shows that moments of lost self-control can end multiple lives and leave irreversible consequences. Victor's decision to dispose of the body also illustrates how, when faced with a mistake, people often choose concealment over facing the truth and trying to make amends, a choice that only worsens everything, turning an impulsive sin into a lifelong burden that ends, ultimately, with a heavy sentence in old age that cannot redeem the harm already done. The fourth lesson concerns the importance of conscience and honesty with oneself. Victor lived for decades under the guise of an ordinary man. Yet inside, he constantly faced the fear of discovery and endless self-reproach. That life can never truly be called peaceful. His eventual confession, though belated, was the result of the pressure of truth combined with exhaustion from living with guilt. This reminds us that truth, however painful, is something people must eventually face, and evasion only makes the path longer and darker. The fifth lesson is about the importance of justice in maintaining societal trust. Every successfully resolved case, especially a decades-old cold case, gives the community the feeling that truth always matters and that good ultimately prevails. It also sends a message to victims' families that no matter how much time passes, there are people who do not forget their stories and continue working to restore fairness for their losses. This case further strengthens society's faith in the legal system, showing that justice, even when late, still carries immense value. Furthermore, Elara Davies' story reminds us of life's fragility and human vulnerability to uncontrolled anger. It urges us to learn self-restraint, protect personal boundaries, and avoid letting conflicts escalate beyond repair. From a community perspective, it is also a reminder that everyone should pay closer attention and be more vigilant when noticing unusual signs in the lives of those around them, because timely concern can sometimes save a life. Finally, this case affirms one eternal truth. The truth is never completely buried, and justice may come late, but it still comes. The efforts of investigators combined with the power of science prove that society continues to advance in order to protect its moral values. That is the greatest lesson drawn from this nearly 50-year journey whose ending not only closed an old chapter, but also opened hope for a future where justice always has the chance to speak, no matter how much time has passed.